I'm Laura, 47, a newly divorced mother of 2 daughters. After a long, exhausting marriage of 25 years, I'm living alone for the first time in ages. I have Megan, who's 24 and well into her career, and Emma, 19, just starting her freshman year in college. I don't have a big support network, so my daughters have been the ones holding me up through all of this. I'm especially close with Megan. She's always been the one I could talk to, really talk to, the kind of conversations that go deeper than surface-level things. She's been my confidant in all this. Emma, well, she's younger, and I've tried to shield her from most of the issues. Things didn't exactly go the way I'd hoped when it came to the divorce. I didn't walk away with a safety net. Instead, I've been left struggling financially, but I haven't told either of them. To me, they've always been my little girls, and it didn't feel right to bring them into the mess that was my marriage and is now my life. They deserve to be young, to live freely, without the weight of their mother's burdens on their shoulders. The separation had to happen. I couldn't stay with him anymore, not after everything. For a long time, I suspected there was someone else, but I never had the proof to confront him outright. The whole situation was wearing me down, and he'd managed to drain not just the life out of me, but also our finances. Legal fees from the divorce, coupled with years of careless spending on his end, meant I was left to pick up the pieces of a financial puzzle he'd ripped apart. He would throw money around without thinking twice, and now here I am, counting every penny and trying to stay afloat. That's one of the biggest things I've kept from my daughters. But it's hard. Megan checks in on me all the time, almost like she's the parent and I'm the child. I know she's worrying about me, even if she tries not to show it. I hate that she feels responsible for my well-being, but she's always been like that, too mature, too aware of everything. Emma, though, is a different story. She's still close to her dad, even seems to idolize him a bit. I know he's been saying things to her about me, things that paint me as the bad guy. He's subtle about it, never obvious enough that I could confront him, but I know he's been trying to turn her against me. It's like he can't let go, even though we're not together anymore. Lately, I've been using Reddit under a fake name to share bits and pieces of my story. There's something oddly comforting about telling strangers what I can't tell my daughters. They listen without judgment, and some of their advice is surprisingly helpful. Posting anonymously helps me feel like I'm not alone, like there are people who understand what it's like to be in my shoes. One evening, after a particularly rough day, Megan called. We ended up on the phone for hours, going over everything but not quite everything, if you know what I mean. I didn't tell her about the money problems or the things her father had done. I still wanted to protect her from that. After we said our goodbyes, I set the phone down and went about my evening. I thought the call had ended, but I was wrong. At some point, I realized the call was still connected. My stomach dropped, and I fumbled for my phone, but I was too late. Megan had heard things I never wanted her to know. There it was, my suspicions about her father, the financial struggles, all of it spilling out in fragments as I paced around my room, talking to myself. I had this awful sinking feeling that I just shattered something for her that I could never put back together. As I tried to process what just happened, 100 thoughts raced through my mind. Should I call her back and try to explain? Or should I wait for her to reach out? Part of me hoped she'd just forget or chalk it up to a bad dream. But a bigger part of me knew that wasn't going to happen. Megan was sharp, too sharp. She'd heard enough to piece together a picture of everything I'd been trying to hide. She'd know now why I couldn't let go of the past, why I was barely scraping by. I wasn't just her mother now. I was a flawed person in her eyes, someone with secrets and struggles I'd been too proud, or too scared, to admit. The worst part is, I'm not even sure if I want to tell her everything. There's a part of me that still wants to shield her, to keep her safe from the truth of it all. I know she'll call back. That's just who she is. But what am I going to say when she does? How do I explain everything without completely breaking her trust? I posted about it on Reddit that night, the guilt gnawing at me as I typed. Strangers on the internet told me to brace myself, to be ready for a difficult conversation, and that maybe, just maybe, this could lead to something good, a chance to finally be honest with my daughters. And I don't know if I believe them, but I don't have much choice now. So here I am, waiting. Just me, alone in this quiet house, with only my thoughts for company, hoping against hope that this mistake doesn't cost me my daughter's love. Update 1. Deep. It wasn't long after I realized the call had been left open that my phone rang. Megan was calling back. There was a long pause before I answered, like I was hoping that somehow the call would just disappear, that I wouldn't have to face what I knew was coming. But there it was, my phone screen lit up with her name, and I knew there was no going back. I took a breath and picked up. On the other end, Megan's voice was calm, steady, too steady. I could tell she was trying to sound normal, but there was an edge to it, something sharp lurking just beneath her words. She didn't ask outright, but I knew she wanted answers. I tried to start with something light, some way to ease into it, but she stopped me. Her question came quietly, but it cut straight through everything. Was it true? The things she heard, were they real? For a second, I considered dodging it, maybe playing it down, or even outright lying, but I knew it was too late for that. She'd heard enough to know, and any attempt to soften it would just insult her intelligence. So I took a deep breath and told her the truth about everything I'd been hiding, about how her father had drained us financially, and finally, my suspicion of his affair. There was a long silence on her end. Then she spoke, but it was different this time. She sounded struck, like she was processing the world in a completely new way. She told me she had never imagined her father could do something like this. It was as if her whole understanding of him had been turned on its head, and she was left holding pieces that didn't fit together anymore. I wanted to reach through the phone and hold her, to somehow protect her from this pain I'd tried so hard to shield her from. I tried to reassure her, to explain why I hadn't told her sooner, but my words felt clumsy, useless. She stayed silent, just listening, letting it sink in. Then, as if she was bracing herself, Megan asked about the money, if things were as bad as they seemed. She must have guessed it wasn't just tight, that there was more to it, things I hadn't wanted to admit even to myself. So I told her. I explained how, during the marriage, her father had spent money as if there were no consequences, how legal fees from the divorce had drained what little savings I had left, and how I was now just trying to keep my head above water. The weight of it hit her hard. I could hear it in her breathing, see it even though we weren't face to face. That's when she admitted something that broke my heart a little more. She told me she'd been feeling this silent pressure to support me emotionally for a long time, but she hadn't wanted to say anything because she thought I needed her. I could feel the guilt wrapping around me, realizing I'd placed this invisible weight on her shoulders without even meaning to. I apologized over and over, telling her that wasn't her burden to bear, that she deserved to live her life without worrying about mine. But she surprised me. Instead of letting it go, she suggested that we should tell Emma the truth, together. I could hear the determination in her voice, that fierce protectiveness she'd always had toward her younger sister. She didn't want Emma to be manipulated, to believe the things their father was saying about me. She thought Emma deserved to know, to make up her own mind. That suggestion threw me. Emma was still so close to her father, and I worried she might not take the news the way Megan had. What if she turned on me, convinced I was just trying to make their dad look bad? I voiced my fears to Megan, and she paused before telling me something I hadn't known. Emma, she said, had already been showing signs of stress, acting distant, and Megan suspected it had something to do with what their father had been saying to her. I could feel the dread creeping in, the fear that I'd only make things worse by opening up. But Megan sounded so sure. She told me Emma was stronger than I gave her credit for, and that, if we approached her together, she might have a better chance of understanding. Megan wasn't a kid anymore. She was confident, collected, and focused on what mattered, making sure Emma knew the truth. After we finished talking, I went back to Reddit, needing a place to put down everything that had just happened. I asked for advice, sharing just enough for people to understand the dilemma. I told them about Megan's suggestion, my fears about how Emma would react, and the strain this was already putting on our family. The replies started pouring in, some telling me to go ahead and be honest with Emma, others warning that it might backfire. Everyone seemed to have a different opinion, but the common thread was clear. My daughters had a right to know. So, that's where I am now. Megan wants to move forward to confront the truth head on, while I'm stuck worrying about Emma and all the ways this could go wrong. I want to believe we can work through it, that somehow we'll come out the other side stronger, but right now I feel like I'm standing on the edge, waiting for the next step in a story that's already taken so much from us. For now, I'm holding on to Megan's words, her belief that Emma deserves to hear the truth. I'm hoping that if we approach her together, she'll understand, and that maybe, just maybe, this won't break us any further. Update 2. A few days after that late-night call with Megan, we arranged to talk to Emma together. Megan was clear, Emma deserved the truth, even if it was going to be difficult. So, we set up a video call, all three of us. I braced myself, hoping this would be the start of real honesty between us. When Emma's face appeared on the screen, she looked cheerful, like she wasn't expecting anything serious. She'd always been closer to her dad, and I could tell by her relaxed expression that she didn't have a clue what we were about to tell her. I felt the weight of it all bearing down on me, but tried to focus on the moment, on being steady for her. Megan opened the conversation, gently leading Emma into it. She explained that there were things Emma didn't know, things that might be hard to hear but that she thought Emma needed to understand. Emma's smile faded, her face turning serious as she realized this wasn't just a casual call. She asked us what was going on, her voice already edged with tension. I began by sharing the basics, explaining that since the divorce, I'd been facing some financial difficulties. Emma's face twisted in confusion, like she couldn't quite process what I was saying. She interrupted, asking why I hadn't mentioned this before, and why I'd kept it hidden. I could see her struggling to make sense of it, so I told her I hadn't wanted to worry her. I wanted her to focus on her studies, to live her life without the stress of her mother's problems. But as I spoke, her expression changed again. She looked defensive, almost angry, and I knew where it was coming from. I could tell she was already drawing conclusions, thinking I was just trying to paint her father in a negative light. Then carefully, I told her there were other things. I tried to keep it as simple as possible, but the moment I mentioned that her father's spending had put a strain on us, she cut me off. She shook her head, insisting her father would never do anything like that. She started defending him, saying he probably had good reasons and that I was overreacting. She even suggested he'd been forced to spend the way he had, that it wasn't his fault. I watched her, feeling my heart sink as I realized she wasn't willing to listen. Not yet. Megan stepped in, trying to help her see things more clearly. She reminded Emma of some of the things she'd seen growing up, things she'd noticed but hadn't understood at the time. But Emma wasn't having any of it. She pushed back, her voice rising as she defended her father, almost like she was defending herself. She accused me of exaggerating, of making her dad look bad just to win them over. The words hit hard, like she'd been waiting to say them, and I could feel the divide between us growing with each one. Megan's frustration was palpable. She looked directly at Emma and asked her to think about why she'd been feeling pressured to choose sides recently. She told Emma that maybe, just maybe, Dad hadn't been telling the whole story either. Emma didn't want to hear it. She shook her head, insisting that I was only trying to ruin her relationship with her father. Her loyalty to him was obvious, and it hurt to see how deeply she'd been influenced. The conversation spiraled from there. Megan and Emma began arguing, both voices growing louder, clashing over whose version of events was closer to the truth. I tried to calm them down, to refocus the conversation, but the damage had already been done. Emma's defenses were up, and she refused to let them down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emma cut off the call. She didn't say goodbye, she just clicked out, leaving us staring at a blank screen. I sat there, staring at the empty space where her face had been, feeling an ache settle deep in my chest. I'd hoped this would bring us closer, but it seemed to have only pushed her further away. Megan stayed on the call, visibly upset. She looked at me, concern etched across her face. She worried that Emma was more hurt than she was willing to show, that this whole conversation had shaken her more than we realized. I nodded, barely able to find words to respond. I could only wonder if I'd made the wrong choice, if involving them in my problems was a mistake after all. Later that night, I went back to Reddit. I updated my post, sharing what had happened, and asked if I'd done the right thing. I told them about Emma's reaction, about how she'd defended her father and blamed me. The responses poured in, each with different advice. Some people reassured me, saying honesty was the best path, while others suggested I should have waited longer, let Emma find out on her own. The mixed responses left me with even more doubt. Since that conversation, Emma hasn't responded to my messages. I've reached out, tried calling, but every attempt has gone unanswered. There's a distance between us now, and I can feel it widening with each day that goes by. Megan has been supportive, checking in on me and trying to stay hopeful, but I can tell even she's worried about Emma. Now, I'm left here, hoping that Emma will eventually come around, that she'll see things for what they are. But I can't help but wonder if I should have just kept it all to myself, if trying to protect her has only made things worse. Update 3. It didn't take long for Emma to start pulling away. At first, I thought she was just taking time to process everything we told her. I kept telling myself that she needed space, that soon she'd come back to me with her questions, ready to talk things through. But days passed, then a week, then 2. I didn't hear from her. I'd send texts, simple messages like, "How are you doing?" or "Hope everything is going well," but the only responses I'd get, if any, were short and distant. It was clear that she didn't want to talk, and the longer this went on, the more it felt like she was slipping away. Megan tried to stay optimistic. She told me that maybe Emma just needed time to see the situation for what it really was. But there was something nagging at both of us, something we couldn't ignore. Emma's change in attitude felt sharp, as if someone else was pushing her to keep her distance. That's when Megan brought it up. She thought our dad was behind it. She'd seen him do it before, subtly planting ideas in Emma's head, making her question things without outright saying it. And now, with the tension between us, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for him to turn her against me. The realization hit hard. I kept hoping I was wrong, but it wasn't long before I got a message that confirmed it. Out of the blue, Emma texted me, and the tone was colder than I'd ever seen from her. She told me that she didn't want to hear any more lies about her dad, that she was tired of being manipulated. The words felt like a slap, and it was almost as if I could hear his voice through her, echoing his old accusations. He'd always been good at twisting the truth, making himself look like the victim, and now it was clear he was using that same tactic on Emma. I tried calling her right after the message, hoping we could talk it out, but she didn't answer. I called again, left a voicemail, but there was nothing. The silence stretched on, and the longer it went, the heavier the weight on my chest grew. I realized I couldn't force her to see things my way, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Megan noticed how much it was affecting me. She tried to lift my spirits, saying she was there for me, that no matter what, I still had her. She reminded me that Emma was still young, still under her dad's influence, and that one day she'd come to her own conclusions. Megan's support was my lifeline, but even she could see how much I was struggling. A few days later, I got another text from Emma, even more distant than the last. She asked me not to drag her into my mess and that she didn't want to take sides. It was clear that her father had gotten to her. These weren't her words, they were his, echoed through her. The manipulation was unmistakable, and it broke me a little more each time. I decided to stop pushing. As much as it tore at me, I realized that the more I tried to reach out, the more I'd push her away. I started posting again on Reddit, sharing my struggles with this painful distance and asking if anyone else had experienced something similar. The responses were a mixed bag. Some people advised me to keep reaching out, to remind Emma that I was always there for her. Others said it was better to give her space, to let her figure things out on her own. Some of the stories people shared hit close to home. They'd been through family splits, painful ones where one parent turned the kids against the other. Hearing how others managed gave me a bit of comfort, though I couldn't shake the ache of knowing that my own daughter, the girl I'd raised and loved, was believing someone else's version of me. Megan's encouragement kept me going. She would come over, help me around the house, and make sure I didn't spend too much time alone. She kept saying that this phase would pass, that Emma would see the truth with time. There were days when I believed her, when I could almost picture Emma coming back, willing to talk things out. But there were also days when I felt helpless, wondering if this was going to be our reality from now on. Then through the grapevine, I heard that my ex had started spreading stories about me to our extended family. He was telling them I was unhinged, that I'd been trying to poison the girls against him. It was a shock, though not entirely unexpected. He'd always known how to turn people's opinions, and it seemed he was doing everything he could to pull my support system apart. At that point, I knew I had to shift my focus. Emma might need time and space to come around, and I couldn't spend every day waiting for that to happen. I started looking into therapy, something I'd put off for years. I wanted to work through my feelings, to find a way to stand on my own, even if my relationship with Emma didn't heal right away. The first therapy session was hard. Opening up about everything, from the divorce to the recent distance with Emma, felt like exposing a wound. But I left that session feeling a small, unexpected relief, like I'd taken a step in the right direction. It wasn't a fix, but it was a start. With each session, I found myself growing a little stronger, finding ways to rebuild without depending solely on my daughters. Emma's silence still hurt, and I still hurt, and I still held out hope that one day she'd come around. But for now, I focused on the small victories, on finding peace within myself, one day at a time. Update 4. Months went by without a word from Emma. I had grown used to the silence, trying to focus on small steps toward healing and accepting that maybe, for now, Emma needed distance. It hurt, but I told myself that one day she'd come around. Then, out of the blue, one afternoon, I got a text notification from her. Her message was brief, asking if we could talk. I stared at it for a moment, half convinced it was a mistake or that I was reading it wrong. But after a pause, I responded with a simple of course. My phone buzzed almost immediately with an incoming call, and there she was, Emma's voice, cautious and hesitant, sounding far older than the last time we spoke. She started with a few awkward words, clearly uncomfortable. I kept my responses light, trying not to push too hard or bring up anything that might make her retreat. I let her take her time. Slowly, she opened up, telling me about her life, her classes, how she'd been managing. But I could sense there was more, something weighing on her that she was holding back. Finally, after a long pause, she began to talk about her dad. She mentioned little things he'd done that didn't sit right with her, things she hadn't paid much attention to before, but that were starting to add up. She told me how he'd been subtly trying to control her, particularly her finances. At first, he'd just offered advice, suggesting she let him help with her budgeting or guide her through her spending. But over time, she noticed he was pushing more, urging her to keep him updated on every little expense and sometimes even criticizing her choices. She said there were times he'd try to guilt trip her, making her feel like she owed him explanations. When she questioned him, he would switch to a softer tone, insisting he was just trying to look out for her, but it all started to feel off. I stayed quiet, letting her talk, only giving her a gentle nudge when she paused too long. Then she admitted that she'd started to feel like she couldn't do anything without him weighing in, and that whenever she tried to pull back, he would imply that she was being ungrateful or irresponsible. Hearing her describe this, piece by piece, it became clear that his behavior was affecting her in ways she hadn't realized before. The more she spoke, the more I could hear the hurt creeping into her voice. She'd believed he was her ally, someone she could trust completely, and now she was seeing a side of him she hadn't expected. Emma's tone changed as she talked, frustration mixing with a deep sense of betrayal. She told me she felt manipulated, like he'd been using her, twisting her loyalty for his own needs. There was a moment where she stopped, as if processing her own words, and then, almost reluctantly, she apologized. She said she was sorry for shutting me out, for taking everything he'd said at face value. She admitted that she had misjudged me, that she'd been so wrapped up in his version of things that she hadn't allowed herself to see the truth. Hearing her apologize, the words she'd held back for so long made everything feel lighter. I didn't need an apology, but knowing she'd come to these realizations on her own made me feel like we were finally standing on the same ground again. I told her that I understood, that she didn't have to feel guilty. We'd all been through a lot, and it was only natural that she would have trusted him, especially after everything that had happened between her parents. Just then, Megan joined our call, and it was like a missing piece clicking into place. The three of us started talking, and for the first time in a long while, it felt easy. Megan shared her experiences, how she'd also struggled with our dad's influence, and Emma listened, nodding along, finally understanding the situation from a different perspective. We talked about memories, funny stories, even small frustrations we'd each had over the years. The laughter felt real, like a bridge being rebuilt after so many months of silence. After the call, Emma and I agreed to meet in person. Megan would join us, and we decided to spend a weekend together, just the three of us, with no interruptions. We needed that time, a chance to reconnect and to start fresh, away from all the outside noise. That weekend, when we finally came together, there was a new understanding between us. Emma was open and honest, admitting the moments when she doubted me, the parts of her that still felt conflicted. I assured her that it was okay, that none of us were perfect, and that the important thing was we were together again. She seemed relieved, like she'd finally let go of the weight she'd been carrying. Before the weekend ended, I shared a small update on Reddit, explaining that Emma had reached out and that we were working through things together. I wrote about how grateful I was for the advice and support I'd received, how it had helped me keep the door open for Emma, even when it was difficult. The responses were heartwarming. People shared similar stories of family reconciliation, offering encouragement and kind words. As I finished that last post, I felt a calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't that everything was fixed or that the pain from the past had vanished, but there was a sense of hope, a belief that we could move forward, stronger and more connected than before. We'd been through a lot, and there would be more challenges ahead, but I knew we would face them together. Update 5. That weekend, the three of us gathered at my house for the first time in what felt like forever. Megan and Emma both arrived on Friday evening, their suitcases in tow, and I could feel the mixture of excitement and nerves hanging in the air. It had been a while since we'd all been together, really together, without the tension of old secrets between us. We spent that first evening catching up, talking about little things to ease into the weekend. Laughter came easily, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness, a feeling that we all knew this weekend was going to be different. After we settled in, Emma took a deep breath and apologized for the cold messages she'd sent months back. She looked directly at me and told me she was sorry for how distant she'd been. I reassured her, saying there was nothing to forgive, that I understood and held no hard feelings. Megan suggested that we take turns sharing our perspectives on everything that had happened, the divorce, the years that led up to it, and the events that had unfolded since. It felt daunting, but I knew this was our chance to clear the air once and for all. I started, describing the suspicions I'd held for years, the quiet doubts and fears that had followed me through the marriage. I told them about how I'd felt like I was watching everything slip away, one piece at a time, as their father drained us financially and emotionally. For so long, I'd kept it all to myself, thinking it would shield them from the truth. Both Megan and Emma listened intently, their faces showing a mix of shock and sadness. Megan hadn't realized just how deep my financial struggles went. I laid it all out, explaining the sacrifices I'd made since the divorce, the ways I'd had to adapt just to stay afloat. Emma looked down, clearly processing everything, and said she'd had no idea. She expressed regret for not noticing, for not seeing the reality that had been there all along. As the evening wore on, Emma opened up about her own experience. She told us about how manipulated she'd felt by her father's words, how confusing it had been to balance her loyalty to him with the things she was learning. She admitted she'd often felt torn, unable to understand why things didn't quite add up, but not knowing how to put it into words. Megan shared her own frustrations, confessing that she'd harbored resentment toward their father for years, especially after understanding the damage his actions had done. She explained that it had pained her to see the strain he'd placed on me, and, by extension, on our family. As we spoke into the night, there was a sense of unburdening, each of us finding pieces of understanding we hadn't had before. At one point, I pulled out an old letter I'd written to myself during the divorce, something I'd written in a moment of desperation, to keep myself grounded. In the letter, I'd expressed my fears, my anger, and my hope that one day my family might heal. Reading it aloud brought tears to our eyes, a reminder of everything we'd been through and the resilience it had taken to reach this point. Just as we were settling into this moment of closeness, there was a knock at the door. I froze, feeling the familiar, unwanted presence of my ex-husband on the other side. He claimed he was just checking on the girls, but I could sense he had an ulterior motive. Emma and Megan looked at each other, both of them understanding immediately that this wasn't just a casual visit. Without hesitation, Megan and Emma stood their ground, confronting him. They demanded answers, pressing him on his behavior and the ways he tried to manipulate them against me. He started to get defensive, brushing off their accusations and shifting the blame back onto me, saying I'd been brainwashing them. I could see him scrambling to regain control, but Emma, once his most loyal defender, made it clear that she saw things differently now. I felt a strength I hadn't felt before, and for the first time I faced him directly, explaining the pain I'd endured, the sacrifices I'd made silently for the sake of our family. I told him that I wouldn't allow him to twist the truth any longer, that we were moving forward without his interference. Caught off guard, he tried to deny everything, but both Megan and Emma were firm, standing beside me and refusing to let him sidestep accountability. Finally, he seemed to realize that his influence over us had ended. As he left, there was a weight lifted from the room. The three of us looked at each other, a sense of unexpected relief and freedom settling over us. We decided, right then and there, to make a pact, to support each other moving forward, and to always be open about our feelings, no matter how difficult it might be. Later that night, I went back to Reddit to share one final update. I described the emotional weekend, the final confrontation with my ex-husband, and the closure we'd found as a family. I thanked everyone for their advice and support, for sharing their stories and giving me the strength to face everything. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, people offering congratulations and celebrating the healing we'd worked so hard to achieve. As I closed that final post, I felt a calm settle over me, a feeling that we were finally on the other side of something heavy. We weren't perfect, and the scars would stay, but we'd found a new foundation to build on. I knew we'd face challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. We'd come a long way, and now I was ready to move forward, together with my daughters, toward a future that felt like it truly belonged to us.